I'll start over. Let me rush to thank Bishop Hunter and everyone who was involved with this conference for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to speak. I never take that lightly. I know what it means to have someone speak to people on your behalf, or at least at your behest, and so I really appreciate that opportunity. Thank you to Drew Henley for that very kind introduction. He is someone as well that I think the way that he stepped into a community where you have to have a lot of patience, where you have to have a lot of resilience and cared for people and just stuck in there and wasn't in it for the vanity, wasn't in it for immediate results or what people might say. When it gets ugly, he's one of those people that you can depend on standing there. So thank you for that. I want to start this conversation off with a video, though, so we can go ahead and play that. So what you just saw was about a few years back. It was the delegate election for the Democratic National Convention. I had run in 2012 and then ran again, what you saw in 2016. When I ran in 2012, there were some things that happened at the Democratic National Convention that really upset me. And it was really the spark that started my organization, which is the AND Campaign, a Christian civic organization. So one of the things that happened is when we met in the large delegation, there was a voice vote of whether to keep God-given, as in God-given rights, in the platform. And it was very clear that the people who wanted it out were louder than the people that wanted it in. And so I left there, and they kept it in for political reasons, but it made a statement. And so I left there thinking, I've got to do something or create something to help Christians in both parties be distinctive. Like, how do we make sure that our witness in the public square is Christian and not simply progressive, conservative, or Democrat and Republican, right? So that's where the idea of the AND campaign comes out of. Well, when I ran again in 2016, I actually ran on what I would call a biblical platform. I was kind of a protest delegate, and I was in the 5th district of Georgia, which is probably the most progressive district in the whole state. But what I wanted to do is to show people that you can run in a space like that was John Lewis's district, and you can win if you have the right message and if you organize. So as you saw, I hope you could hear it, not only did I talk about poverty and things of that nature, I talked about abortion, talked about the sanctity of life. I talked about gender identity and how Christians may disagree with the party on that, but deserve to be represented. And in the most progressive, probably one of the most progressive districts in the South, me and my slate won by almost double the votes of anybody else. And I don't think anybody would have thought that was possible because we just don't try it and we're told that it's not possible. Now, I wish I could tell you that after I gave that speech that everything went along happily ever after, but that wasn't the case either. So we ended up winning, but there were some people from the LGBTQ community and some other communities that said that I was being homophobic and that I was being against women and all these things. Now, being in politics as long as I have been in politics, I kind of saw that coming. So what we did is we recorded it, right? And so when they said the things that I said that were offensive, well, we said, well, watch the video. None of that happened. But what I also knew that I had to do is I had to get clergy in the city of Atlanta who were prepared and willing to call the Georgia Democratic Party to say if something happens to Justin, there's going to be a problem, right? So not only were we able to think through and win that event and really send a serious message, we were also ready for the fallout of that. And I think this speaks to what I really want to get at today, which is dealing with maneuvering through a polarized culture. Polarization, I'm sure I'm not surprising anybody by saying this, is a very serious problem in our politics, but it's also a problem when it comes to our church. I mean, churches are breaking up. We had pastors before we wrote our book that were telling us that they literally had people in their church fighting in the church over political issues. That's how polarized things were in 2016, and I'm afraid maybe even in 2024. So we have this polarization that's being in the secular space that's being reflected in the church. You have families who aren't talking. You have friends who don't speak anymore. People literally going to different churches because of the politics, right? For maybe good and bad reasons. And then we also know that polarization in our society has come to a point where it's keeping us from getting things done. We have an immigration issue right now that's getting worse as we speak. And we can't get anything done because you have these two bases that won't allow either side to be reasonable when it comes to that conversation. We have an economy that is not as inclusive as it should be. And regardless of which side you fall on the political spectrum, I hope we can agree that the housing crisis, the wage gap are issues that really you would like to see more work done on, but you don't see the agreement. You see, I won't say any names, but there are some politicians who, if you look on their Twitter, they're talking more about kind of the political gossip and who said what and how bad the other side is, and not really talking about policy and the issues that they were sent to talk about. And so one way that some of us have dealt with the polarization is to try to prove that our side is more right? Is just to continually push, and you choose a side because these are major issues, and you may very well be right, and the other side may very well be wrong. But just stressing how right you are isn't gonna be what I think changes things, because I don't think this is all based on logic and what the best idea is. I think there's a spiritual component, but I also think that there's a pride issue on both sides that needs to be dealt with. And so what I want to do today is I want to offer you a framework that I think will help us get through this polarization. And I'll just tell you up front, this framework isn't about us finding more ways to explain why the other side is wrong. This framework is doing what I tried to do at the Democratic National Convention delegate election. This framework is actually us looking at ourselves and being able to critique ourselves. It's a pastor being able to get their congregation, whether they have folks on the left or the right, to say, okay, I know your problems with them, and you might be right on that. Can you critique your own stance? Can you critique, based on biblical scrutiny, who you are and what you should be? And that's kind of what we want to get at. So that's, in a nutshell, what I'm going to be trying to talk about today. Just hopefully it's a hopeful framework for you to get through some of these issues, again, not by being an expert on what everybody else does wrong. I think we do that pretty well. But actually being able to connect with others, hear what they're saying, and critique your side. Because I would say that the leaders in this next generation, or these leaders that are going to get us through even 2024, are going to be the ones that can turn around and with love explain to their own, here's what we might get wrong too. So let me start with Scripture. I want to go to Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15. Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15, and it reads, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ, speaking the truth in love." How do we engage a polarized socio-political space with biblical fidelity? I won't hide the ball. The lesson today, based on biblical doctrine, is that we can't engage faithfully without love and truth. Or to put it another way, without justice and moral order. One of the biggest problems I think that we have in our public square and in the church, and why we aren't necessarily making things better in many cases, is that we've divided ourselves into justice Christians on one side and morality Christians on the other side. Justice Christians believe in many of the things that you may see in progressive spaces, and they're worried about making sure that people are being treated well based on their identity and things like that. Morality Christians are based on those other issues, the sanctity of life and marriage and things of that nature. The question I want to ask us, though, is that faithful? Does the Bible create those same divisions that we seem to have created? Because we can't choose our party over gospel imperatives, nor can we choose a political ideology over biblical doctrine. What I'm trying to say is I think the world and the political space has created divisions, and we've accepted those divisions, but you don't necessarily see those in the Bible. As we search for answers to the problems that afflict our society today, I am afraid that Christians are being tossed back and forth by the waves of false cultural doctrine and blown here and there by the winds of flawed pop culture prescriptions. We get exposed to a trending topic or a fancy theory in academia, and we begin to put our faith in political parties and ideologies that talk good, that may flatter us, but aren't actually edifying. They can't show proof of concept. And more importantly, they aren't biblical. But yet and still, based on the cultural identity of the messenger or the political party of origin, we follow that which leads us into godless territory. So when it comes to political engagement, if the postmodernists will have their say, if the rugged individualists will speak, and the identitarians too, the people of God must not repeat them. We must speak for ourselves. When we do speak, we must make sure that we're speaking the truth in love. Are Christians speaking the truth in love in the public square today? Is that what we're known for? Even with an intellectually honest and fair assessment, could we say that people see us as being known for that? The conversation about engaging politics to better society inevitably must address what teachings we follow and what methods we employ to achieve our objectives. Today, many Christians have been seduced by ideologies that are made with human hands and can't withstand what I talked about earlier, biblical scrutiny. And I think the Bible speaks to this. In Ephesians 4, Apostle Paul is talking to the church of Ephesus. We know that this is the persevering church. Ephesus has endured a lot of suffering, and they also had false prophets who were trying to infiltrate the church with false teachings. Earlier in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about being mature. Now, when he talks about being mature in this scripture, in this passage, He's talking about growth in mind, growth in understanding, growth in knowledge of the truth, and growth in moral character. So when he says, when we mature, he's saying when we grow in understanding, when we grow in knowledge of the truth, when we grow in moral character, then we will no longer be infants. Infants are malleable, right? Young people are impressionable, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. What's Paul saying here? Paul is saying that mature Christians are not easily deceived. These false teachers wouldn't be able to indoctrinate mature Christians because mature Christians should know what they stand for. Regardless of what false teachings are prominent, regardless of what pop culture is saying or popular opinion is saying, and here's the big one, regardless of how much they're suffering, mature Christians should be able to speak the truth in love. And in so many instances, we've set up this idea that depending on what you're going through, you may be exempted from having to do that. Well, I think the Bible would disagree with that. Mature Christians, regardless of what's going on, are able to speak the truth in love. Christians should never let their circumstances or the tactics of their opponents dictate who they are. Again, we see a lot of people who don't like certain politicians, and if you watch them closely, they become like those politicians. The angrier they get, well, they're mean, they're bad, they speak this way, we're not mean enough, and we become like them instead of pushing against that, right? We should never let our circumstances or our opponents dictate who we are. This means that in all circumstances, we should be peacemakers. Right? That no matter how bad it gets, we won't address others with contempt. And what is contempt? Contempt is a feeling of disdain. It's a feeling that someone else is worthless. It's an affront to the Imago Dei. Now, we know that everybody wants to claim the civil rights movement of these days. People can be on two different sides and have two different reasons why that legacy should belong to them. But what I think people miss about the civil rights movement is one of its primary guiding principles. Yes, it was about changing systems. Yes, it was about changing institutions. But there was something even more important than that was attached to the civil rights movement, which was no matter how bad it got, no matter how evil your opponent was, you could never allow them to negatively impact your spirit. Because you could change systems, you could win the policy battle, but if they had a negative impact on your spirit, you had lost too much. In fact, it was better to lose the policy battle than to allow your spirit to be negatively impacted by someone else. That is a profound thing that I don't think you find in any ideology, because it doesn't necessarily make sense outside of a spiritual understanding or a growth in moral character, correct? We must always be able to speak the truth in love. And this doesn't just apply to our personal relationships. Today we're talking about politics. This applies also to our cultural and political interactions. Now, political and social ideologies are not all bad. What ideologies do is they allow us to take our thoughts and our values and kind of order them to some extent, right? You can decide whether progressivism or conservatism is best in a given situation. But one thing that I can tell you is that neither of those very popular ideologies are the gospel, meaning that both of them are fallible. One of the biggest factors in the polarization that we see is that too many conservatives can't tell you where conservatism tends to go wrong. And too many progressives can't tell you where progressivism tends to go wrong. We present our ideologies in too many instances as if they're almost inerrant. But the truth is, the most prominent ideologies often separate something that Christians have to hold together, which is love and truth. They separate them as if they are in conflict. as if they are mutually exclusive. One side is supposedly all about love, while the other side claims to be about truth, and then Christians are told, as we engage, to choose between the two. Well, if you hear anything that I say today, please hear this. I believe that is a false choice, a false dilemma. A Christian can choose a political party. A Christian cannot choose between love and truth. They are not in conflict. As we grow, we should understand that they are actually interdependent. You cannot be loving and untruthful. Right? You cannot be truthful and have no love within you. Tim Keller put it very well. He said this. He said that love without truth is sentimentality, meaning it's overly emotional. It's lacking in substance. And truth without love is harshness. It's mean. It's uncompassionate. We've been presented with a false dilemma. Our society has presented us with two wrong answers that has created a false dichotomy. And so what I'm telling Christians is that just like Jesus did, when you're presented with a bad question or a question that has two wrong answers, you don't answer the question as presented, you reframe the question. Jesus does this over and over. You ask him a question, well, that's going to lead to a bad answer. Let me reframe the question. And in many of our social issues, instead of answering one way or another, we need to reframe how we go about it in general. You cannot let ideological tribes set the terms of how you respond if the way that you would have to respond leads you to be unfaithful. These ideologies tend to either be lacking in love or lacking in truth, and as a result, when it comes to political ideology, to be conservative or progressive at all times and on every single issue is not only intellectually lazy, but I would argue that it's also easily manipulated and it's unfaithful. If every time you're presented with a problem or a policy and you always land on the conservative or progressive side, how do you know that there's any thinking that goes along with that? That is, again, intellectually lazy. It often means that you have outsourced your opinion to others because those ideologies don't even stay in the same place. Should a Christian be always conservative or always progressive? I don't think so, because ideological conservatism and theological conservatism, I'm theologically conservative, they're not always the same thing. Do we know the difference between ideological conservatism and theological conservatism? The far right's conception or the far left's conception of social justice is not always consistent with a biblical understanding. Can a Christian agree with everything that's labeled social justice? No, we listen to what the substance of what the Bible has to say about justice in the social context. We don't follow everything that somebody else may label social justice. We have to think through it, right? If we're conservative, when an issue calls for change or the dismantling of old prejudiced structures, then we're helping to maintain injustice. If we're progressive, when the moment calls for the regeneration or the preservation of moral order, then we're complicit in society's rejection of the truth. What I'm arguing right now is that to be progressive or conservative all the time is at some point going to put you on the other side or in opposition to the gospel. These are not lines or distinctions that are drawn in the gospel in this way. Jesus did not say, you know what, the Herodians are bad, let me become a Pharisee. And that's what's happening a lot today. I think those Pharisees are really bad people. I have to be a Sadducee now. No, how about we have to be more faithful now? We don't have to go along with the lines that have been drawn for us. A Christian cannot simply follow behind an ideological tribe. We must be supplying both of them with heavy doses of love and truth if we're going to be who we are called to be, and if we're going to put a stop and healing on this polarization. Now, what I've given you is a framework. Part of that framework is about love, social justice, right? Compassion. The other side of that framework is truth, moral order, right? Convictions. We're going to see how these come together, but I want to first talk about that first one that I bring up, which is the love and the social concern involved in all of this. It should pain us that other communities, that people who are our neighbors, might be able to legitimately question whether or not they are loved by Christians. And I think in this last conversation that you guys had about gender identity and those issues, if we're honest with ourselves, throughout the history of the church, there are people in those communities that could validly say that they felt unloved. Whether they were pushed out the church without explanation. There are some terrible stories of people who were abused in the church, and when they identify differently, then the church kicks them out the church. Or those people who laid by themselves during the AIDS epidemic and the church wasn't there to comfort them. That's something that we have to deal with, and it's something that we should feel a way about. Love doesn't guarantee agreement or affirmation, but it does call us to be concerned about the well-being of others. You can understand systematic theology, and you can memorize the entire Bible, but if you're unloving and uncompassionate, you very simply are not Christ-like. And this is where some conservatives can run into trouble. We've been commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we can't do that if we're not willing to advocate for our neighbors' well-being and to protect their human dignity. If it's all talk, if we go to 1 John 3, it shows us that love is doing what Jesus did, which is sacrificing for others. And if you read it, it's showing you that in a situation where in your sphere of influence you could help somebody, but all you do is give them words and nothing else, that's unfaithful. Loving words in a context where you could provide for somebody is insufficient. We have to understand that. We have to love someone is to protect them, is to be self-sacrificial where you can. And I think that's all a biblical definition of social justice is. There are many distorted definitions, but I think it's that love in a social context. Do you provide? Do you care about somebody's well-being in the social context? Are you making sure that they're being treated up to a certain standard? Because according to the Great Commandment, if you would want and you would seek justice for yourself, then you must want and seek justice for others. If we truly love our neighbors, we will again be socially concerned, and that social concern will be more than just a sentiment. It'll be active. It'll involve self-sacrifice. See, because I think love and justice are more than just hate, than just not being hateful or being unjust. They have their own substance. And so if I'm sitting in my house and there's a bunch of injustice outside within my sphere of influence, I might be able to say I'm not unjust, but I can't say that I'm just. Right? They have their own substance. We supposedly, and this has been a big discussion, we supposedly have Christians who are against social justice. Right? That's been the debate. We don't, this is something that's bad, and I admit that there are some distorted versions of that. But I'll tell you the truth, I don't believe them. I don't believe anybody is really against social justice. I think it depends on who you're talking about and who they want justice for. Right? Some just limit it to the people that they care about and deny it to others, or if it would be an inconvenience. And here's what I mean. I don't believe that anyone sitting in here today, that if their family member was being unjustly imprisoned and they could do something about it, wouldn't do anything about it. I don't think anybody sitting here today would let somebody they love sit in jail and they could get them out, and they just didn't do it. I don't think anybody sitting in here today would allow the children in their neighborhood to drink lead-poisoned water if there's something they could do to prevent it or stopping it from happening. That's what the definition of social justice is, right? That you would not only do that for your people around you, but that you would do it for other people. And all of that it's saying is that because we are made in the image of God and because we have dignity, that there's a certain standard in society that we must be treated by. And when society or anyone else treats us below that standard, Christians have an obligation to speak up, to be self-sacrificial if they can. That is the substance of the love that we are talking about. All these people would do these things because they believe in social justice. They believe in that standard that I just talked about. But one thing that we have to realize, because I think Christians are very charitable, and that's been true, and I love it, and I think that's great, and a lot of times we don't get enough credit for how charitable we can be. But I think we do need to realize that justice can be much harder than charity. Justice can be much harder than charity. There's a reason that some people will give you charity long before they give you justice. Again, charity is good, but charity sometimes can be distant, and the giver is in control of how much charity they give. The giver is in control of how much that charity impacts them. Justice, on the other hand, is a God standard. It's either given fully or it's not given at all. Right? Justice threatens to disrupt the very systems and societal arrangements that benefit us. Here's the big one. At some point, justice demands a conflict with self-interest. And so when many people say they don't like social justice, maybe they're saying that they don't like the conflict of interest or the inconvenience that it might bring, because you don't get to choose how much justice you give. It could dismantle the very podiums and platforms which we place our pride and stand atop to look down on others. Justice brings a conflict with self-interest, especially when you've had power and others have been left powerless. Are we ready? Do we love enough? Do we care enough to engage that conflict with self-interest? To be self-sacrificial. So that's the love side of it, the compassion side of this conversation, the self-sacrifice that we want to give for others, right? Let's talk about the other side of this framework. Truth and moral order, the conviction, right? In Ephesians 4:15, the term speak the truth comes from the Greek word that refers to teaching or professing the truth, often as it relates to doctrine. Again, this is not subjective. For truth to mean anything, everyone cannot have their own separate truth. To speak the truth means to profess right doctrine or to be honest in how you recount events. We worship a God of moral order. From the beginning, we see there's a design, that there's an order that he provides us with. God's truth provides us with direction and structure. A lot of people talk about liberation, and liberation is good. We have a God that is a liberator. That's absolutely true. But liberation without direction and structure is quite simply to be lost. It doesn't have all that much value within itself unless it's striving or frees you to do something more and it gives you direction to do something. In an ever-changing world, God's truth is unchanging. And I know we're in a postmodern age, and so as you speak to the young people in your church, you have to speak very clearly about truth and the importance of truth. In a lot of urban settings, like the one that I come from, everyone wants to be progressive. In fact, Christians, I think, have kind of a cultural inferiority complex sometimes, especially if you've come out of a more traditional church, and you almost want to prove yourself to be progressive. Some of my friends who come from the smaller towns and things like that are now the most progressive people you'll find, because in a way I think they were trying to prove themselves to others that no, I'm not like them. I get it. I'm like you. Right? That's what happens. But I think when it comes to the truth, this is where progressives get into trouble. Because when we think of being progressive, we're thinking about moving forward. We're thinking about fixing old errors. We're thinking about fixing things in general, and that can be good. Listen, we live in a broken world. Some things, some institutions, and some systems will be broken, and they will need fixing. If you're too conservative to admit that, I think that's a problem. But being progressive is not the answer in every situation. If you're on the edge of a cliff, just to give you an example, if you're on the edge of a cliff, to progress or to even lean forward probably isn't such a good idea, right? It's also a bad idea to progress if you're already headed in the wrong direction. What we have to understand in this postmodern age is that sometimes God is asking us to stand firm on his word and preserve things and institutions that he's already established as good. If he's established it as good, sometimes we're asked to stand on that. But modern thought tells us that we can improve everything, that what is new is obviously better than what is old, that change in certain direction is always good. And I understand that, but you just don't get that out of the Bible. God's truth, no matter what modern thought says, cannot be improved. And let me give you a good illustration for that. You can think of God's truth sort of like a masterpiece or a Picasso. You can't improve a Picasso. You can only deface a Picasso. If you go up to a masterpiece of any kind with a brush and in some type of erasing agent, I don't care how great of an artist you think you are, if you add anything to it or you take anything away from it, you have made it worse. You have not improved it. And so our job, in a way, is to see, okay, what is broken and needs to be fixed, and what has God already said is good, and if I mess with it, if I take anything from it or add anything to it, I'm making it worse. We have to think through doing things like that. Because God doesn't need our counsel. He doesn't need us to improve or evolve his truth. Sometimes what seems good and pleasant to us is destructive. Sometimes we have to understand that our moment is hiding something from us. That the popular opinion has its blind spots, that there's something in this moment in time, just like we can look back and say, what were they thinking? The same thing is happening for us. And we need to stand on the truth, whether we completely understand it at the moment or not. Or we end up making similar mistakes. Again, God doesn't need our counsel. Sometimes he's calling us to obedience, and this is a bad word in some spaces, and self-denial. Imagine that. In a self-indulgent culture, God would call us to self-denial. This book here tells us to die to self. It does not tell us to be self-indulgent. So when I talk to young people a lot of times and they say, I just don't understand why God want to hurt somebody or not let me do what I want to do, I say, let's go through the Bible, and after you read the gospel, you tell me if it's more so about self-indulgence or self-denial. And if you see that self-indulgence in there, then I agree with you. But I don't think you'll see more self-indulgence than you see self-denial. And we have to understand, once again, why that is important. Because this book consistently is telling us about self-sacrifice. So you may be saying, Justice, are you saying that I can't be progressive politically? I'm not saying that. But when in conflict, when your progressivism comes into conflict with Christianity, your Christianity must override your progressivism, because progressivism, just like conservatism, is flawed. And too many Christians cannot tell the difference between their faith and their ideology. And whether Christianity is right or wrong is really based on whether it can pass the scrutiny of a flawed ideology. And we have to be able to show people that if we're going to deal with this polarization and the pride that people have in their ideologies, we've got to be able to show them that. One of the things that I ask people to see if they really are thinking through what they believe is to give me 5 to 10 things that their side of the aisle gets wrong. Can you tell me right now 5 to 10 things that you get wrong? And if you can't do that, then you've been indoctrinated. Then you've begun to believe things uncritically, which is the same thing that you blame the other side for. And so it's this mirror that we can show people to say, well, you don't like it that they just accept everything that Republican leaders say or everything that Democratic leaders say. Do you question that? Do you critique that? You say that you wish conservative Christians or progressive Christians would turn around and correct their side. Do you do that? And if not, we see that we have a lot more in common with our opposition than we might otherwise think or be willing to admit, I should say. Jesus provided us, I believe, a model of social renewal that was concerned about marginalized individuals in society, and one that I think we can follow today, that we should pursue the same course. But he didn't simply patronize them with sentimentality. Jesus loved people. It's a model of love, the embodiment of love, but he didn't coddle. Do we understand the difference between loving someone and coddling someone? Usually that has to do with the truth. Jesus was pretty straightforward with the truth as he loved people. Do we know how to love people in the same way in an environment that says love and affirmation are basically the same thing? Otherwise, you're erasing me, you're harming me, and all these other things, right? That wasn't Jesus' point of view. In John 8, the case of the adulterous woman who was about to be stoned, he tells her, go. I think that go was his love liberating her from these hypocrites who were about to hurt her. Go. Get out of here. You're free of this, of what they're trying to do to you. He's releasing her out of a sort of societal bondage. But he didn't stop there. He also tells her to sin no more because the other half of the truth was that she'd never completely be free until her heart changed and she turned from her own internal sin. Right? Similarly, in John 5, the lame man was told to stand up and walk, and then later told to stop sinning. Because the woman wasn't only a victim of external bondage, but also of her own internal bondage. The man's infirmity wasn't only an outward disability, there was another matter that he had to deal with inward transformation. And too many times, one side is saying, I don't see any systemic bondage. I don't see, outside of the issues that I want to talk about. But when you talk about the other side, there's no such thing as this systemic bondage and people being held back by institutions. And then on the other side, it's everything that has gone wrong is always a system or always an institution and never the person or at least the people that we want to defend. The Bible doesn't break it down that way. People run systems, and therefore broken people running broken systems, you will have both. Christians need to be able to see that, not only to see it, but to be able to articulate that. Because we see a similar theme in Exodus. God delivered the Hebrews from Pharaoh's hand, but he doesn't say go and live happily ever after. And I truly believe God is a liberator. I read liberation theology and things like that, but what you miss sometimes in liberation theology is the other half of the story. God doesn't take them out of Egypt and say, go flourish and do whatever you want to do. That's not how the rest of the story goes. God delivers the Hebrews from Pharaoh's hand, but he also gives them the law and demands their obedience. He chastises them. Yes, God is a liberator, but he's also a father that requires moral order from the liberated. He brings wrath upon the oppressor and calls all his children to self-denial so that they don't become oppressors. This is the gospel if we're going to take it as a whole. But too many Christians have embraced ideologies that are keen on identifying how others have sinned against us while blinding us to how we're being devoured by our own sin. If the adulterous woman were here today, one side of the church would be saying, stone her for she has broken the law, and the other side would be saying, slay queen, live your truth. And both would be leaving her in chains, right? Both would be leaving her in prison. That was not the pedagogic creed of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. He taught that the unjust and disobedient will receive God's wrath, and that Christian love is unconditional, but it's not without discernment or critique. That Christian love is unconditional, but not without discernment or critique. It's time for us to tighten up our philosophies, our methodologies, and our ideologies, and adhere to what is more of a gospel standard. Now, I want to give you a few things, practical things we can do in conversation to help people get away from all this polarization, right? So you have the framework. I think the framework helps us critique ourselves. It helps me say, okay, I'm a little more to the left on a certain issue. I can't just point at the other side and talk about how bad they are. What might I get wrong myself, right? And to do that through a biblical lens. How am I bringing the love and truth together? Am I treating the Bible like it's just a treatise of black letter law? Or do I understand how compassion and empathy play within how I treat people and how I view policy? Am I putting skin on policy so that we understand it? So one of the things I think we absolutely need if we're going to get anywhere and advance in any way within this polarization is humility. Humility is very much missing from this conversation. And here's what I mean. We go into issues that are very serious issues, and I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that it doesn't matter, if the other side wins, it's not a big deal. These are life and death issues. It does matter. But I think one of the problems that happens, especially on issues like race and others, is that we go into these conversations with these ironclad narratives about who we are and who our community is. And the sad thing about these ironclad narratives that make sure nobody can ever poke holes in them is that they're in part fictional. They're not real. And so we go into a conversation with other people, and we're not seeking the truth within that conversation necessarily. We're first and foremost defending ourselves. We're in this defensive posture. We're not really ready to have a moment of self-examination. We just want to make sure that I come out of here and you can't blame me for any of the stuff that you're talking about. But I would ask you, as we go into these situations with these ironclad narratives, think about how many people went to Jesus with an ironclad narrative and walked away with that narrative intact. Why do we think that we can go into a conversation about major issues, defending an ideological tradition or defending any culture or ethnic group, and walk away as if we have a perfect narrative? And the sad thing about it is that everyone else knows, we know that the other side's narrative isn't perfect. So we pretend amongst each other, and we have no credibility or trust among each other because we know we're not telling the truth. Neither side. And you can't heal polarization, you can't heal the discourse unless we're willing to have an honest conversation. We do not have all the answers. But in order to be humble and have a strong discourse, we also need to be able to listen. My friend Lisa Fields from the Jude 3 Project says that listening is an act of love. And too many times when we critique people on the other side, we do so without ever considering what good they were trying to achieve. You can disagree with the conclusion, but in order to really assess them and analyze what they're thinking, you have to at least know what good they were trying to achieve. And so are we willing to take the time to say, okay, that conclusion seems wrong to me, but here's what you're trying to get at. You're trying to protect women. You're trying to make people feel loved and feel included. Can I acknowledge that within the conversation and acknowledge, here's the other thing, where I've been wrong? Can I go into a conversation and say, yeah, we do get this wrong. How can we do that better? Defuse the conversation to actually have one that can be constructive. But it takes humility, and unfortunately, in our culture war, to ever admit that you got anything wrong is losing a point, right? Everything is zero sum. So when you admit that your side, even years ago, got something wrong, then you've given up something that you shouldn't have given up. And it pushes us to a place where we are just prideful, and the crazy thing is, we get so prideful about our ideology that we will now hurt ourselves just to prove the other side wasn't right. How do Christians speak into that? Is it really about proving our ideology is right? Or is it really about healing, building relationships, and showing that we actually love other people? And here's the other thing I would add to it, and I only have a few more minutes. I would add that we need to also have intellectual honesty. And let me tell you something about these ideological tribes. They are in no way, shape, or form committed to intellectual honesty. They're not committed to consistency. The only thing that they're committed to is winning. And so if I have to completely be dishonest about what you said, what you meant, then I'll do that because I have to win in this moment. But one of the things that the AND campaign always says is that our witness, what people are hearing from us, what they think about what Christianity means and who we represent, our witness has to always be more important than winning. And I think some of the biggest places where Christians have messed up in culture or in politics is because that we put winning over the witness. And so people saw us win, they saw us maintain some sort of dominance, but they didn't see the gospel. And so I'm a political strategist. I never strategize to lose. I never want to lose. And like I said before, these are major issues, so losing hurts. But when in conflict, we have to be able to be faithful in the public square. We have to be able to lose to make sure that the gospel was represented correctly, to make sure that people saw the will of God, to make sure that people understand that we love people more and we love God more than we love winning these political battles. Not saying it's easy, but if we're going to be faithful, we've got to take that stance. Again, we're coming into these spaces with our narratives. And you can even look on social media right now. Anytime there's a tragedy, even before all the facts come out, people are trying to put their narrative on top of what they know. They're trying to give you their ideological conclusion before they even have all the facts, right? One of the things that happens to us when we're too ideological, and I think it leads to more polarization, is we're all about promoting and defending ideological conclusions rather than seeking what's good and true. Because if we're seeking what's good and true, sometimes we have to wait to find out what actually happened to assess it properly. We can't automatically say, see, I told you how bad they are. Look, you see that? Well, you don't even know what happened. That's intellectually dishonest. Sometimes we have to say, and this doesn't happen very often anymore, I don't know. Or I don't have an opinion on that right now. In order to maintain this intellectual honesty so that people can see that I want to get this right. I don't want to just tell you how much better the way I think is than you. So again, we have this framework of compassion and conviction that helps us understand that doctrine matters, that your theology matters, that you should be able to separate what is your theology and what is your ideology. Another good exercise is to say, okay, you have this opinion, tell me where the theology is, like what parts of the Bible, and tell me where ideology might play a role in that. Again, ideology is not always bad, but people should be able to disconnect those. Because I think in many cases we've allowed our political affiliation to become religious in nature. And that's never going to end well for us. So we have love and truth. We see how those come together. And then we have things like humility, intellectual honesty, and being willing to lose if it means spreading the gospel in a better way. And so I think these are some things that if we really practice them, if we really separate ourselves and are willing to turn and speak to our side and admit what our side gets wrong, I think that leads us, and it's a hard job, there's no button we can push, but it leads us out of this polarization that we see in our country today. Thank you.
So, Justin, as you said, you're a political guy as well as a theologian and Christian leader. So anybody who knows anything about politics knows it's been rough and tumble since before there was America. And certainly politics was rough and tumble in colonial America and has been all the way up to today. But most of us feel like something's different in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 10 years maybe. What's different to you, and what about that is important to our current work, leading, as you said, these politically divided churches now?
Yeah. I think that's a good point, because I think some people can say, well, this is the worst America has ever been. I don't know. I mean, you think about civil rights, you think about slavery, there's been moments that were worse. But there is something different about this when it comes to modern history. And I think one of the differences is what I call opposition-centered politics, where if you look at the statistics, people say they vote against something more than they vote for something. We've been brought to believe we're more ideological now, and I think we've been brought to believe that if somebody's in another, is on the other side of the ideological spectrum, that everything they do is meant to deceive, control, or harm us. Right? So it's almost like they're not capable of doing anything good.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw this. I mean, that's a lot of what was going on during COVID, right? And we don't want to get back into that debate. But you saw a lot of people's opinions were based on being on the opposite side of one political actor or another.
Right.
You have one side that says, okay, let's follow the science, and that we do that when it's convenient. We do, don't do it when it's not convenient.
Yeah.
A lot of it was based on who said what. Yeah. And people died, right, based on what they were believing and what they were hearing. So I think it's that opposition-centered politics. And in many ways, I think there are a lot of economic issues and other issues, and the polarization gets placed on other, issues that we were just talking about, but there's other deeper issues that we're not addressing because we're so polarized, but it's kind of self-perpetuating. Yeah. So the more that we move forward with it, the worse that it gets, the bigger the divides get. And I think that's why Christians need to think through some of these things rather than leaning on, certain commentators or whatever that really are just feeding us red meat.
So you use a term today that I did yesterday about reframing things. So just for the sake of this discussion, if things have boiled down to, and I know it's more complex than this, but have boiled down to the kind of oppositional thinking and oppositional feeling that you're describing, what's the reframing that we can do as Christians, or have you already said it in the love and truth? Like if you were working with somebody, how would you lead a group of people through reframing or rethinking that oppositional instinct?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, at first, it does come out of that framework. First, within any question, so let's take the idea that, if it's an LGBTQ issue, do you hate this person or do you affirm them? Yeah. Well, those aren't my only two options, right? In fact, what else works that way? I mean, everyone in my family have something probably strongly we disagree about, but it doesn't mean we don't love one another. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't sacrifice my life for that person. Right. So I'm not going to answer that question in the same way. I'm going to say I love, but this is what I believe. You're reframing the question, but I think a lot of people, especially younger people, have been pushed into that tension, and the tension's uncomfortable, and you get a lot of, I think people come at you pretty hard on that, depending what circles you're in, and you just want to get out of the tension, so you jump all the way to what would seem like love, but becomes kind of sentimentality, and leave the truth behind. I think for Christians, one of the main things we have to do to kind of reframe things is allow ourselves to live in a tension.
Yeah.
Right? The tension, it's not a tension for God, but in our brokenness, there can be a tension between love and truth. Are we willing to stand in that tension and understand that we have to continually try to get things right? The other thing is the honesty portion is huge. This is what we get. It's flattering to hear that my culture is perfect, but I know that it's not. And I can't go into a conversation with somebody else and not admit what we've gotten wrong. And that critique of myself isn't self-hate either, right?
Right.
It's something that's needed in order to have a discourse that works.
Yeah, conversation for another day, but it makes me think of how fractured we are as a people, not just in America, but all over the world. I wonder how much of running to ideology or to partisan politics is something of just a cry for a community of like-mindedness. And so then everything you're saying kind of disappears.
There's definitely a community aspect to it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look, the people who are kind of the custodians of ideology, they're always going to use that. You're one of us.
Yeah.
We're wrapping our arms around you.
That's
Look
right.
what they did to you. And so you start to say, wait. I mean, even in the church. I mean, people who are leaving the church, they go into space and say, look how they did this. Look at what they did. And one of the things that is tough is that when you're familiar with one community, you see the issues with that community. You go into a new community, you may not see those same issues because you're not as familiar.
Yeah.
And so you can focus in on what the other community did wrong, not really knowing that all communities have a brokenness. Can you identify the brokenness in the new community that you're in? And if not, you may be in trouble because you're not seeing it.
Yeah. Again, there's so much to say, conversation for another day, but the intellectual honesty you call for, I just feel it in my bones so much. And man, that's a big thing, to get to the place sort of psychologically, socially, and just you're willing to do the cognitive work to be intellectually honest is a big deal. All right, one last one, and then we'll turn it over to our colleagues here. Peacemaking this is rhetorical. Peacemaking seems weak. It doesn't feel strong. And I think for a lot of us, speaking as a white person, last week celebrating MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail and thinking about the kind of white moderates that he was talking about, that's something that a lot of us feel and that I know you've seen your whole career. So just talk a bit again from your biblical frame about how love and peacemaking is not actually weak and is not the kind of thing that Martin would have been concerned about when he was talking about moderation.
Yeah, and I think one distinction people make is between peacekeeping and peacemaking.
Yeah.
Peacemaking is about shalom, right? It's about well-being. It's about completeness. If I'm in a disordered, unjust situation and I do nothing, that's not peacekeeping, right? That's not peacemaking.
And that's what Martin would have been concerned about.
You're not peacemaking in, what I call the pious bystander, that, you may do the rituals and all that stuff, but you don't want to get into the messy stuff.
Yeah.
You're not a peacemaker because that's not peace, right? You can't see injustice and immorality, do nothing, and say it's peace. That's just a fraudulent peace. And so I think peacemaking is, again, it's active. Just like we were talking about love and justice.
So it's not weak, it's active.
The furthest thing from weak. I mean, you look at somebody like Frederick Douglass, right, who escapes as a slave, makes it all the way up to speaking to the president, engaging and debating people who believe slavery was right. There was nothing weak or scary about what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was as brave as you can get. And so we just need to get our definitions together.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, sometimes it can be weak and cowardice to carry guns and shoot people and try to intimidate people, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's much harder and more brave to take a different course.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I know you guys have some more practical sorts of questions to ask for in your church work. So we've got 15 minutes or 17 minutes here for some questions.
Justin, thank you for bringing your expertise to the conversation, for leading us with your experience. So I'm curious, I really liked the self-application for honest, just an intellectual honesty that you talked about. I imagine as you've applied that you aren't always met with honesty on the other side. So I'm curious how you handle that and even try to guide when others maybe aren't willing to live by the same standards that you are.
No, that's a good question. I mean, and again, just keeping in mind that the honesty is for its own sake, right? It's something that you got to do regardless of how people respond. But a lot of things, what I find when I'm in a debate or a conversation with somebody who's doing that, the honesty side of it is sometimes for the observers, right? It's for other people to say, oh, he's actually willing to admit this or that. Sometimes sometimes the other side does respond, but I think it's that public witness to say, man, somebody who's being honest themselves feels a kind of way that, man, you're actually opening up and admitting things and I'm not. So I don't always worry about what the other side is going to do. Hopefully they're kind of inspired to say, no, you're right, we get this wrong too. And that does happen. If not, people are still seeing that honesty and it's still seeing a message, or planting a seed in the person you're talking to that may not come forward at that moment, but later they say, there's a better way to do this. What I'm trying to do is get people out of a defensive posture, and I never feel like a discussion or even a debate is about settling it right then. And the message that you being willing to be honest, the message that sends is something that should carry past that conversation. And I think that's really the point of it. It's not trying to win, right? It's not necessarily trying to win, because in these circumstances, when it's very ideological, rarely do you win in the other person's eye, but can you set an example and send a message?
Justin, thanks so much. Part of the ideologies, part of what comes with them is a sort of totalizing picture of what's possible. Both left and right seem to suggest that they can really arrive at this absolute picture of what they're after. But part of what we hold is a bit more tempered sense of what we can do. How is that included in this holding of truth and love? Is a bit of humility about what we can really pull off on our own.
No, you make a good point, and I said that earlier. Both sides make these promises, but that they don't have any proof of concept. They've never actually done it. So progressives have never shown us that autonomy really leads to this utopia. And in fact, I would say that sometimes that self-indulgence and autonomy keeps other people from getting anywhere close to a utopia. On the same thing, in the same space, conservatives have never shown us a perfect meritocracy. And so if they've never shown it to us, it doesn't mean that you can't somewhat strive for it, but maybe they don't know exactly how to get there. And so I think what Christians do, and I think that's what's different between what I would call orthodoxy and ideology, is it forces you to admit what you're not able to do, what you haven't accomplished. You're not in control of the answer. And so with orthodoxy, you have set principles that can't move in the way that, in many cases, ideology does. You say, no, this is what I have to get at. If I fall short of that, I have to admit that I fell short of that, because I'm not necessarily in control of all outcomes. And that goes to the humility piece. Yes, I want to change culture. Yes, I want to change systems. Even if I have some victories, the truth of the matter is 10, 20 years down the road, they could be reversed. And so what I think Christians have to do in these spaces is to say, I'm doing it because it's important, but I'm really doing it to glorify God. And Fannie Lou Hamer had a quote that really stuck with me. Someone asked her, like, why do you do this when nothing's changing? And she said, I do it because I have to do it, because God sent me to do it. So whether something changes or not, that's not up to me, that's up to God. I just have to be faithful and do what I've been called to do.
So Justin, your work on love and truth that you did today is obviously the right thing. But let's make this personal a little bit. What do you have to do in your personal life? Like, think of your own spiritual disciplines. What do you do to continue to ground yourself in this obviously really hard work of love and truth?
It's tough. I mean, number one, what I find helpful is obviously just staying in the Bible, continue to read, kind of admitting things that I've done wrong, and then just being in the local church. You know, I don't ever want to get too theoretical with it, because it's easy for me to stand up and say love and truth. We got to bring those together perfectly and not actually do it when I'm interacting with different people that I disagree with.
Yeah.
And I just find in the local church, the elders and others keep me honest to say, no, I don't. And people who listen to our podcast, I try to every now and then say something that I messed up on, because it can be easy when you're talking to other people to make it seem like you have it all down.
Yeah.
And that's not what I'm trying to say at all. I get it wrong. There are times that I want to say things, and there might be tweets that I left in my drafts that I'm happy that are still in my drafts.
Yeah.
But I think prayer, Bible, and then the local church is so important, because you run into people in different situations that you have to have patience with, and they have to have patience for you, and they know you better than the people that you may be talking on the podcast to, you know, on your podcast to.
So a little deeper, when you find yourself in a moment of, let's say, impatience, or when you find yourself in a moment of, man, I don't feel that instinctual love, what's your self-talk like? Like, what do you bring yourself back to when you find yourself not, you know, engaging in the way that you'd like to?
The first thing that I try to do is just not communicate, right? Like, not, if I'm feeling that moment, say, you know what, that doesn't sound completely right, just don't say anything for now.
Yeah.
And I have, you know, I've been able, over the years, I've been able to do that a little bit more. Is just say, step back, that's not true. Or just think about, you know, one of the big things that always brings me through is the example and the model of the civil rights movement. So when I have moments and I'm like, man, is this worth it? Or, you know, can I deal with this? I think about the people and how much they went through. And if, you know, the things that they went through compared to what I'm going through aren't much. If they can do it, I can. And I think that kind of brings me back to say, if, you know, somebody can get shot with a fire hose, have dogs put on children, and not reciprocate, I don't have any excuse, you know, to reciprocate or go outside of that. Still not perfect, but I think that example has inspired me to do better.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yes.
Justin, do you have anything hopeful to say about the role of money in politics?
I think that's a trick question.
Yeah.
Hopeful about the role of money in politics? I mean, you know, if you read, there was this study done called Hidden Tribes. And the Hidden Tribes study basically said that America's discourse is controlled by two groups: devoted conservatives and progressive activists. Devoted conservatives are about 6% of the population. Progressive activists are 8% of the population. But they control the whole discourse because they have the most money. And those people are you know, whether it's cable news or whatever, they're in control of what we talk about. Not necessarily what we think, but certainly in many cases what we talk about and the issues that are brought up and how they're brought up. That's concerning. But what I know is that there are a lot of races where money is not enough either. And that if you can organize people, if you can inspire people, if you have leaders that can speak to people, money can be overcome. And we've seen that through, you know, the civil rights movement didn't have a whole lot of money, right? But they made change. And I think that's very different than what you see on the left now. Like, in a lot of ways, the left, very well funded. They can cancel people. They can do all these other, they can get these companies to join them and have all these major companies on their side. It's very different. But that can be defeated by, I think, leaders that can speak to the people and inspire people and galvanize people. So I can't necessarily say I see that at this very moment, but I know historically, and you can see spaces where money's not always enough to overcome everything. And that's where we really need to be prayerful. We need to be supporting, you know, kind of leaders and organizations who are trying to speak to the people and can do so in a way that's bigger than money.
Okay. All right, someone else? Well, then I'm going to check my notes. Justin, pop culture, whether it's delivered to us through music or streaming or TV, or as you say, cable TV or cable news, talk radio, various forms of social media, that stuff's really powerful, as you were saying.
Yep.
How do you how do you teach Christians, and what would you say to this group of pastors that would help us not just be down on that stuff and sound like Luddites, but engage well with something that is genuinely powerful, as you said, if not truth-making, at least driving conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recommend watching cable news, but if you're gonna do it, if you're gonna do some of it, and this I'm gonna talk about this a little bit probably tomorrow as well, is you want to do so with what we call media hygiene, right? So you don't want to just listen to progressives who give you biased confirmation or conservatives who give you biased confirmation all the time. Each one of you should have a conservative and a progressive and maybe somebody that breaks those binaries like Esau McCauley or something like that that you listen to or read on a regular basis. If you only read or listen to people on one side, it's just not good hygiene. And your politics will stink because of it, right? You have to hear everybody out. Because if you are at the point where you think everybody on the other side is dumb or bigoted or whatever, you haven't exposed yourself to enough people. There are people on both sides who are intellectually honest. You may think that they're wrong, but they're intelligent, intellectually honest, and really care about these issues. If you haven't identified anybody like that on the other side, then I think that's a you problem, and you got to take the time to do that because they're there. You got to take the time to find them.